All right, welcome everyone. Uh, so this week, this session, this time together, we're going to talk about Heidegger and the Greeks, which is a late piece by Gadamer from 1990 that was originally presented as a talk about the continuing relevance of Heidegger was the original title, and they changed it to Heidegger and the Greeks when it got collected in the collected essays. So the first start, the way I like to begin is by asking if there's something that is on top of your mind that you just cannot wait to talk about. That if we talked about anything else, it would just be a frustration for you as you wait until we get to the really good stuff. So I'll take volunteers at the start of something, if there's something that's really burning in your heart. Yeah, Shaba, go right ahead.
Sorry, I just couldn't find how to raise my hand electronically, but I would be very, very interested in the topic of the separability of theory and practice, or the alleged non-separability, as in the third, roughly the third part of the tool Gadamer claims it. That has to do also with the interpretation of the first sentences of the metaphysics and the Nicomachean ethics, and I'm not quite sure that that I can follow what Gadamer says there. So that would be highly interesting for me.
That's great. That's one of the big topics, right? It comes up at the beginning and comes back at the end.
Right.
So maybe we should just look right at those passages where he makes this claim that they're not really separate or not separate. And not only not really separate, but they're not separate in the ways we tend to think of them not being separate, if that makes sense. It's a very different way than we. Shaba, did you have some quotes or some passages where you wanted to start us looking?
Yeah, unfortunately, I took rather the German version, but I find it immediately. That is on page 38, 39 in the German, and fortunately, the English has the German numbers as well, and that is then roughly on page so on American 33. That is at the bottom, I think 33. No, sorry.
Well, can I just suggest it?
Yeah.
I think this starts on page 31.
Sorry, yeah, that's a proper number. If I mean, I hope that I'm able to formulate my problem sufficiently clearly, but Gadamer claims here that that practice, that theoretical, that the theoretical and the practical cannot be separated, right. And in the first, so at the end of the first paragraph on page American 32, Gadamer claims that the practical basis for both is the practical basis for both is not theoretical. It has to do with the self-elucidation of factual existence, the hermeneutics of facticity. And the question now is whether we consent to the claim that that theoretical knowledge is self-elucidation, Selbsterhellung, of Dasein. If we take the first sentence of metaphysics, then pantes anthropoi tuae denai oregontai physei, all humans strive for to know, or something like that, from nature, or based on nature, and it is connected to Taumadzein, to staunen, and I don't really see the connection between practical orientation in ordinary life and this kind of theoretical discovery, or this being theoretical surprised in a positive meaning. So that's roughly. I don't know whether it was coherent or understandable to some extent at least.
So if I understand it, Shaba, you're talking about the beginning of the metaphysics. I think it's typically translated in English that all humans by nature seek to understand, or something like that, seek understanding. And that for you doesn't seem to have this connection to practical life the way that Gadamer is suggesting
Yes.
it does. That okay?
No connection to self-elucidation.
Oh, self-elucidation, right?
Yeah, that would be the point.
Yeah.
Because the first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics that concerns the teleological structure of human action. If I do something, then I want to achieve something with this action, and what I want to achieve that must be regarded by myself in a positive manner. I have to regard it to be something good. But that's the structure of practice or action. And I mean, I think Gadamer puts these two things together in a problematic way.
Okay, what a great way to start. So, are people looking at the text? Are there places that you want to sort of take up the challenge on Gadamer's behalf? Yes, Eric.
Yeah, I wanted to keep running with your question, and I'm sorry. How do you pronounce your name?
Chaba. Yeah.
Chaba. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Chaba. So I think this is kind of the point, right? That there is this general distinction that people hold to between theoretical knowledge, which is over here, and then practice, which is over here. And then the last line of that paragraph, after you stop reading, just the last two sentences. Thus, the practical basis for both is not theoretical. It has to do with the self-elucidation of factual existence, the hermeneutics of facticity. And then here, Heidegger had already sketched this relation between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge in his early TypeScript. So what I'm understanding is that you're exactly right, that there's this problematic distance between them that Heidegger and then Gadamer kind of picking up on this. They're trying to bridge that distance. Is that how you're reading it too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, further on the page on 33, he says Heidegger grounded Aristotle's introduction to metaphysics in facticity. That is, the Greeks don't separate and set apart against each other theoretical and practical. The context here is the hermeneutics of facticity, that is, self-elucidation. And that is something which is inherent in human being because existence is hermeneutic. But what are the modes of self-elucidation? What is the language of self-elucidation? And he starts by saying, well, you might think theory is the mode of self-elucidation. But in fact, theory is rooted in practice, as Heidegger showed. So that applies to the Greeks, but to the Greeks only, not that's not. There are other modes of self-elucidation, some more reasonable and some misguided. Okay, so he's saying that Heidegger is the one who here, and a lot rests on that verb in the metaphysics. Men strive to know. So it isn't that they just know, it's that knowing is an activity they engage in, which is itself rooted in practical life. Yeah. I could yammer on, but I won't.
I always thought we should just look specifically at the paragraphs at the bottom of 31 onto 32, because that's exactly where Chaba is raising the questions about how Gadamer's argument goes.
Right.
I mean, I think Don's right. If we go back one paragraph, the one begins in 1921. Heidegger began to renew his studies in Aristotle intensively. He began at the time not only by reading the main works of Aristotle, he began with rhetoric, in which situatedness is thematized. You see where we are here? And a well-known context of the second book, because the speaker must arouse effects, an old doctoral point in the Greek theory of rhetoric. The point was taken over by Plato in the Phaedrus and elaborated by Aristotle's lecture on rhetoric. It is from being situated that existence rises to self-elucidation. So that's, I think, one of the first times that self-elucidation arises here, right? With sort of an idea of being situated. Part of the rhetoric of being situated is that we are constantly bringing things to language anew, right? And elucidating ourselves at the same time.
Right.
That's the idea. Okay, now here's the big paragraph, Java, right? This
Yes. Yeah.
Now, theoretical cognition is certainly only one way in which existence elucidates itself. I think that's fair. That's pretty straightforward, right? There's lots of ways in which existence can elucidate itself, and theoretically is one of many. We can say with Klaus Held that contingency has become our Western destiny, a contingency which cannot be excluded from the histories and fates of human beings. I agree and only expand upon it when I say that what emerged at the time was mathematics, the capacity of thinking, which culminates in providing proof. So that will be the structure of theory. Is that the idea? Is proof making, a certain kind of reason giving, will be what marks theoretical reason in the Greeks?
I think the implication is that's the way things developed among the Greeks.
Yeah.
And that shadowed their conception of the theoretical.
Yeah.
And what meets the criterion of the theoretical. And he wants to say it isn't just necessary proof. It isn't just apodictic demonstration. Okay. In fact, and they a little bit lose sight of. Yeah, can I just add one more text relevant to this? So on page 33, in the first full paragraph, he talks about Heidegger and the young Heidegger. It took me, I had to read this several times to sort of sort it out. But I think what he's saying is that Heidegger is troubled with questions about his Christian faith. So he's thinking about that. And when he comes to the Greeks and sees the emphasis they put on pure contemplation, Heidegger, as a Christian, already feels that there's a limitation to the Greeks, that that's not quite right. This overemphasis on contemplation misses something that's there in Christianity. Okay? Even though he himself, Gadamer says, then by talking about making the issue forgetfulness of being, he himself overemphasizes the contemplative. Okay, but he can see that there's something wrong about that. There's something more fundamental than that. Okay.
Right. Okay, so we gotta make sure that's part of the story too, as well. One part is about way Gadamer is connecting together theory and practice. And then the further concern that theory gets emphasized too much in the Greeks and pure contemplation, at least through Heidegger. So, John, did you want to get in here? John Beach? I thought I saw your hand up. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, John.
Unmute.
Muted. Unmute.
I think I'll just, I mean, I could say a few things just generally speaking, but I think we're heading in a good direction here. And I would just say that it's just from a general, like stepping back point of perspective, I think that it's very clear that this distinction does not exist in Plato or Aristotle, that it's a modern distinction. Basically, Gadamer is following Heidegger in this regard of pointing this out and following Heidegger's, beginning in situatedness, and that's why he refers to the early works and to the thing he said to Nator and the ontology, the ontology of facticity and so on. All this Heidegger concentrates very much on being situated, and this is how he builds a bridge to Greek philosophy that's totally lost in modern translations. And then we have this with the Heidegger and the Greeks is I remember, I'll just jump to the end here of what I was going to say. Is that I remember once after Heidegger's lectures, he and I had a little conversation, and he said, "You see the way that Heidegger has, shakes hands with the Greeks, and sort of there's a unity there that so like he swept all this Cartesian stuff aside, this way of looking at the self, but building it up from the praxis, from the you can read these early works, you see that this is how Heidegger said, this is how we should interpret Aristotle, by looking at ourselves in a different way. And he found this because this is what the Greeks did. And, you get this whole idea of the subject and the ego and the self-consciousness, just get rid of that, and to a certain extent, like the primacy of all that. So that's the general contexting I would put it in. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. Of course. I don't want to lose the thread of Chaba's argument. So I'm going to go back to that paragraph because he talks about providing proof as the beginning of science, logic demonstration. And this, I think, is the shift, if I got this right, Chaba, where Gadamer then says, yet it will be good to start with the self-elucidation, so then this, I think, was what you're wondering about is, wait a minute, how does self-elucidation get in here? And how does that become the character of theoretical philosophy, theoretical reasoning? Is that fair? He says let's start with self-elucidation, which expands in its entire scope out of the praxis of life and later becomes the theme of practical philosophy in Aristotle. So I suppose the idea is that in our praxis, we're also trying to make things intelligible through language, to self-elucidate ourselves doing these things. And that at the same time then becomes the scope of practical philosophy as we also reflect upon what's happening and how we're articulating things and making sense of things, which Aristotle carefully demarcates in relation to theoretical philosophy. So Aristotle then sort of says there's this distinction between the practical and the theoretical. So far, so good, Chaba?
Yes, of course, and I have to remark concerning John Beach's contribution that the distinction between theory and practice is fundamental for Aristotle. It's not only a modern projection into Greek philosophy, because Aristotle established even the distinction of theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy as the second as a kind of description of human affairs with ethics and politics combined, and also economics is a very rudimentary form. So the distinction and the possible bridge between the two is also interesting in an Aristotelian framework because I think it's far from being trivial.
Well, fair enough, but there's no, this is often, we find this in Heidegger and even more so in Gadamer, where you have these concepts that are distinct but not separate, if you know what I mean. It's different. I mean, Aristotle is full of this, like in Book Delta, in his definitions and so on, he explains a bunch of different ones. And you can't have one, you can't isolate them and totally eradicate the other. And Gadamer says somewhere here that, and I think it's a good way to look at it, that, there's a certain primacy to the practical, but that's how you get to the theoretical, is through the practical. But you never, and as Don says, like the hexis, the struggling, the striving, and so on, which is essential in all ethical stuff, and there's never a telos, like there's never an ending to it, in the way we think of it, and so I would say that yes, you can talk about a difference and the words having different meanings and so on, but when you look at how they where one stops and the other begins. I don't think you'll find that in Greek thought and Plato or Aristotle.
Now,
Yeah, I wanted to come in on that issue because it seems that he's stating something in this essay that you might not find. I think Chabal made the same point. You might not find stated by Aristotle. He says on the top of page 33, there simply can be no separation of theory from praxis. Right? That seems a very odd statement to me. And then the rest of the sentence, or the next sentence, reads, "This is the reason why Aristotle can say all human beings naturally strive towards knowledge." So that's the Aristotelian line. And then his own line is, "Here striving comes first and pure contemplation only develops out of it." It sounds like the theoretical attitude and contemplation are byproducts of practical life for Gadamer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you'd find Aristotle saying the contemplative life is a byproduct or something that merely folds out of practical. They're completely distinct objects very often for Aristotle, right? The object of the practical life is the contingent and the changeable. The object of the theoretical life is the superior science, is the necessary and the necessarily true. So I don't know if Gadamer is over-egging things in that reading. I'd be curious to hear what you think, if you think that's a sustainable reading of Aristotle.
Can I just say, I think you put your finger on it. We do see in Plato's Parmenides telling Socrates that it cannot be that knowledge is for the gods and sensation is for the human beings. That can't be. So that separation is not possible. Gadamer, in interpreting Aristotle, said something that I found, I'm not sure I understand it or why he says it, but it is on 32-33, where he says the relation between these in Greek is complicated. Aristotle does not put theoretical life above the practical, which is, that's always a problem with the Nicomachean ethics. People say, does he put the contemplative life higher than the practical? Which is higher, active or contemplative? And he says he sees the theoretical life as for the gods. There's book Lambda, the metaphysics, where the prime mover is contemplation, self-contemplation, but that's not, he says, this is not for human beings. Human life is founded on praxis, and the theoretical becomes subsequently possible as an improvement.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand what he meant by that, but it is his interpretation that even in the Nicomachean ethics, the contemplative life, Aristotle says we have to be pro-eternity. An odd Greek word that he invents. We have to be pro-eternity and therefore oriented toward contemplation. But is he saying that we achieve contemplation, or just that that's a sort of continuing goal that we strive toward as the Greek sees it? Okay. But we don't actually get there. That is not for us. That is for the gods.
Right.
I'm not sure. Okay.
I think there is a type of, it's higher or superior in the sense that it's a contemplation that is, it's self-contained. It needs nothing else to be what it is, where the practical life, well, you need relations and promises to other people, you need institutions, you need type of codes of conduct. That practical life is kind of dependent on so many changeable things. And that's why he keeps two objects, right? So the theoretical life is that which is true always, or for the most part, the practical life is that which can be otherwise. Keep it. And Aristotle seems to keep those things neatly separated, I think.
Let me support what Niall just said. The political form of life is inferior to theoretical form of life for Aristotle, because it depends on respect, on time, as it is developed in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. If I want to be a politician, I need prestige. I need the recognition of others, and that's a form of dependence, which I don't have in theoretical life, in contemplation, because that's a non-independent and non-invasive attitude towards the well-ordered cosmos.
And also related to that, and on topic, the for Aristotle, the one who embodies phronesis the most is in fact the statesman. It's not the average citizen, it's the statesperson is the one, is the phronimos. And that would be connected to it being not a derivative science but not the superior science. Politics or ethics definitely does not deal with things as the highest things. But at least I think with Heidegger, there's a clear move there. And Heidegger says, for Aristotle, actuality is higher than possibility. Right? Contemplation, the theoretical attitude, contemplates that which is always true, actuality. Practical life deals with possibilities. And along comes Heidegger and says in these early sophist lectures, he wants to invert the primacy of that ordering, and wants to say higher than actuality stands possibility and being in time. And I think he's inverting what he takes Aristotle to be saying. And I think Gadamer is trying to rescue Aristotle in this essay to say, well, Aristotle is already saying that theory is only kind of an offshoot of practical life. But I think he's asking too much of Aristotle. He's turning Aristotle into a kind of a quasi-Gadamerian Heideggerian. At least that's my feeling.
If I'm talking too much, tell me to shut up, okay? But just in the metaphysics in Book Lambda, one of the issues that Aristotle is concerned with is how does the prime mover generate motion in the universe? And he says it doesn't do it by any mechanical process, by transmitting its motion, because it is immovable. The way it does it is by being perfection and lovable. And that is something that moves people. They move toward that. Their mind desire, they desire it because their mind tells them it's good. Okay. And that leads them to attempt to move in a way that draws them closer to that. The Phronimos, the statesman, is someone who grasps the good in some degree and tries to move the polis toward it. Okay.
Practical, the practical good, though. The practical good.
In that sense, he tries to make it active as a practical good. And even in the Republic at the end, there remains the problem that Plato points out. Why would someone who could actually contemplate the good take time out from that in order to guide the polis? And the answer, I think, seems to be, if you really understand the good, the function of the good is to make things be. That's what it does. Okay. And so if you really are trying to be like the good, you also will try to make things be. You will cooperate in that process of making reality come to be. It's a complicated issue, but I think it is possible to defend Gadamer's view here that not only does the theoretical rise out of the practical, the theoretical is, for the Greek, not separable from the practical, in that the theoretical then reflects back into the practical and helps to guide it, so that it is involved with the practical. And this is different from mathematical proof. I mean, that's why on page 32 at the top, he talks about someone else at this conference talked about contingency. There's a contingency inevitable in human life. It is not subject to apodictic demonstration. Yeah,
that helps, Don. I mean, one of the things we're really looking at is trying to figure out how to make sense of the idea that they're implicated in each other. I think that goes a long way towards even that. Jay Goulding, you've got your hand up. Thanks.
Well, can everyone hear me? I was going to say how much I'm enjoying the conversation. I've been working on Heidegger's understanding of the Nicomachean ethics. There's something that occurred to me in the discussion. Looking at the English versus the German, you have the word phronesis. And here's an expression that Gadamer was very interested in, and various people talked about it, phronesios deuke stelete. And it's about where he's talking in book 6 about how everything forgets, but conscience never forgets, is a really interesting expression. This gets, I think, a little bit sidetracked in the English where it talks about practical wisdom. Phronesis is really important. Like what I've been working on is that fragment 112 from Heraclitus. There are 8 ideas there, and Gadamer addresses most of them. I think what several people are saying, he's trying to rescue Aristotle in some respects. Heidegger has a different take on all of these things. The terms phronein, arete, sophia, alete, legen, poiein, physis, and so forth. Heidegger starts with arete ist phronesis, and he says, Tugend ist Wissen. This is where he starts. This is in the 1920s. So here you have the idea of virtue is wisdom. Now, I'm going to come to the end of this comment there, but I was thinking what John Beach said before. If you're reading Gadamer, you've got to look at Diels and Krantz and Jacobi and Müller and Geifert and so forth, Autenried. If you're doing Heidegger on these texts, you have to go before that or you're lost. You have to go to Pazov and Schneider and Schellers and other people. So this, to me, that I said, here's the convergence of concealed positions in Gadamer around that phronesis that plays out in either practical or theoretical and so forth. What I've come down to finally saying then is that there's a cascading of ideas. Gadamer is really talking about it. There's a cascading of ideas in Heidegger from those earlier texts where he sees Phronesis as Einsicht, Klugheit, Umsicht, and a bunch of other terminology down to this big one, which is Besinnung. So here's the body sensibility of the mindfulness that I think Gadamer is trying to preserve in Aristotle. There's an alternative reading. If you go with practical reason talk, then you're stuck on Roman interpretations. Gadamer is trying to go underneath that. Okay, one last thing, then I'll stop because I've been going insane looking at this stuff the last couple of months. Heidegger collects all of his understandings of Phronesis into one expression that he calls Acht ist Wacht. Die Acht nehmen ist die Wachturm des Seins. So taking care is the watchtower of being. And this is what Gadamer calls the Einblitz. And I think that's available in this essay. What's amazing of Gadamer is that Heidegger's deep into the textual stuff. Gadamer steps back and takes a breath, sits down in his chair and says, what is the bigger picture of things? I think that's what's very valuable. Anyway, I'm going to stop before I go insane on all this stuff. But I really am enjoying the conversation. It's making me rethink a whole bunch of stuff.
That's great, Jay. Thanks. That's a lot here. Csaba, you want to get in?
Sorry, I wanted to pose a clarificatory question for Don Marshall. So if there are contributions or remarks on Jay Golding's contribution, then they should have go forth.
I think you're good. I think those ideas will be around for the rest of the discussions. We don't have to give
Okay,
them.
so
They're on
I
the
would
table
be
now.
I would be really grateful if Don could explain how theoretical knowledge would come from the practical, because for Aristotle it is not possible to the extent that only theoretical knowledge has to do with the causes, with the archaiki. So theoretical knowledge gives us explanatory power, and that is in no way included in any kind of theoretical, oh sorry, of in any kind of practical implicit knowledge or whatever. So I would be interested in how Don sees this this question, because I think that we lose the specific, the particular achievement of theoretical knowledge if we simply subsume it to our daily routines, and we say, okay, there already was in our everyday knowledge or implicit routines, there was all theoretical knowledge already contained. So
well, I appreciate it, but I kind of like to let Nathan talk, since I've talked a lot. And so I do have something to say, but I would like to
Don,
let
you
Nathan
go
speak.
ahead. Mine's a little bit slightly different. So you go ahead and respond
Okay,
first.
well, I just think Jay sort of hit it squarely, and that is on page 36, Gadamer introduces the term, which gets translated wakefulness. And I think, I had in my mind the question, could you call this mindfulness? So wakefulness is what is common to practical and theoretical life. Okay. They both require you. He says we clearly need wakefulness for theoretical contemplation, but we also need it when we try to find what is good, better, or best. And Aristotle called this phronesis. It's an astonishing move to translate phronesis as wakefulness, but it connects with the prime mover, who is constantly wakeful. Okay. So wakefulness is Gadamer's, I think, attempt to characterize, as it were, phenomenologically, what is common to theoretical and practical thinking as the Greeks understand it. Now, I take this itself to be an example of the kind of thinking with the Greeks that he's talking about. That is, he's saying the Greeks teach us how to make our language rise into conceptual, and I'm going to do this by taking an ordinary word, wakefulness, and raising it up to a theoretical function in relation to both practical and theoretical knowledge. He is doing the thing he's talking about, what we should be learning from the Greeks how to do. Wakefulness is itself an example of how we learn to think with the Greeks. And that doesn't mean just translating their terms. It means finding the words in our own language that express this insight. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There are lots of people I would love to hear from.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think we'll probably be talking about that some more in the next hour. Eric, I got you in mind. I know you're in the queue. I'm going to have Niall and Tom get in, and then we can get back to Eric, okay? Yeah, now.
I'm happy you brought up, Don, the wakefulness, because Heidegger's famous translation of phronesis is Gewissen and not Wachsamkeit. So it's conscience, and I much prefer Gadamer's. I think Gadamer is more faithful to Aristotle in saying what was really at stake for Aristotle is something like wakefulness. And I think another way of parsing it would be something like a type of deliberative vigilance, right? There's a type of being vigilant in deliberating well. I think that's the type of wakefulness. But I think the prakton agathon of wakefulness is a different type of agathon than the agathon of the theoretical contemplation. I think David is absolutely right. They implicate one another. But the way they implicate one another, in my opinion, is that one needs the ethical and political life to be taken care of so that one can contemplate. And so they're co-needy some way, but they're distinct, and their distinctness is quite fundamental. I think that they facilitate one another. More praxis, good praxis gives rise to the space of contemplation. And I think you're right. There's like the theoretical life needs also a type of wakefulness, but I'm wondering if they're identical forms of wakefulness, or can we separate them out a little bit? So the idea of a type of vigilant deliberation is what's happening what the phronimos is doing. And the phronimos, I think, is more political than theoretical in that sense.
I want to first check with Don and Csaba. Csaba, do you have something you wanted to say in response to what Don has said and what Niall has said?
Yeah, it's an attempt to give a common feature, but the question is whether there are other phenomena that could be characterized also with Wachsamkeit or the vagueness, and in this sense, I have the impression that there is in Gadamer's description a tendency to reduce or to trace back the theoretical to the practical. And I'm not quite happy with that. If you want to see why I insist on this, then we could say that in Heidegger's Being and Time, you find a very similar strategy as to the reduction of the theoretical to understanding in Dasein. But that's a side remark. Okay, so
Great, thanks. We have Eric next, and then Tom. Eric, go ahead.
Thanks. This has all been really great. I want to go back to where we were on page 32, and back to Jay Golding talking about getting back to the Greeks to move past this Roman interpretation or kind of Latin framing. I wonder if another way to kind of play with this relationship of theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge is Kant's statement that all knowledge begins with experience, that we have this kind of theory about experience in its vast possibilities versus theory about experience in terms of action, to maintain that idea of practical knowledge. It just came to mind, especially when we moved into talking about wakefulness or being woke, that the Enlightenment is trying to name itself this kind of, to name it the Enlightenment is to connect with this kind of wakefulness that I think goes back to Niall's point about the political structures that kind of need to be in place so that people can actually theorize well, that there's kind of this primacy there. Anyway, that's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Tom, are you ready to get in?
Yeah, I'm worried that I'm gonna, I've found this conversation really, really interesting, and particularly sort of going around the theory and practice thing. And so I'm going to raise something, and really, I'm kind of asking people who know much more about these things than I do, and it might be of absolutely no interest to anybody, which is fine. So I was interested at the start. I mean, at the start, he says, doesn't he? The Greeks talking about theory and practice, real stuff that we do today. Let's not talk about that. I thought that's interesting because why? Sort of interested in the context of that. And then the first thing you notice about Aristotle, sorry, it's a bit of a roundabout to where I'm going. He talks about Aristotle's rhetoric, and of course, the importance of rhetoric is it's kind of taking away the practices of the sophists from the foreigners, from the people competing for the academy in terms of the space. So it's actually, it's a fine work of philosophy, but it's also about a kind of marking out the job of philosophy, literally the work that they're doing, work in the sense of what they're doing every day. And all the way through, there are these constant references back to work. You know, there's just these examples that get thrown through, like the meaning of Uesia is farmers' possessions. You know, it kind of goes with that and raise, which I thought was really interesting. And then as he's talking about work in this kind of quite, you know, keeps referring to the work in a sense of artisan work and, you know, farming and the Greeks as artisans. And then there's this paragraph right in the middle about Max Weber being an amateur, which I think it might make more sense in the German, because about how Weber's an amateur and he turns up as an amateur and he, you know, undermines, and then they're saying that Heidegger has done something that Weber couldn't possibly do, and there's a very strange, I mean, I don't speak German well enough to get that it was all paper compared to Heidegger. As I was reading it, what I was getting is there's this sort of undercurrent which may or may not link to the whole idea of practical wisdom about actual, you know, the actual work, actual jobs, actual work. But on top of that, you know, that's very much focused on the artisan and the farming and the, you know, the sort of Greek side. But on top of that, you've got these professors talking and about the sort of amateurishness or which then isn't discussed in any sense in terms of, you know, because that's the kind of modern thing. And, you know, I didn't have enough time to read it or to see if this was worthwhile or not, but I just found the reference to the amateurishness of Weber really interesting. I don't think they're insulting Weber, but it seems to be some kind of in joke or something like that. So I just found the relationship the whole way through. I haven't read another bit by Gadamer, and this just could be my way, where he talks about, he just starts throwing in jobs quite so much, and they kind of emerge as examples, and then he doesn't necessarily follow up on them. But they're clearly important because they're related to his reflections on Heidegger. And then there's reflections on Heidegger as a professional leaving his job and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I was particularly interested if anyone could shed on the Weber example, because it was baffling me.
I mean, it's a funny story. It's on page 32. In fairness, he does put amateur in scare quotes, right? So other people see Weber as just an amateur, but then he gave up
Strauss
and did something brilliant, right, off the cuff.
Yeah.
But John Beach, did you have something on this?
No, because I don't think this is all that important. I think it's a bit of a swat at Strauss, but I want to get back to Szabo, what Bob was saying, and I have a question for him.
Oh, wait, John, wait just a second. Let's
okay.
Here we get a chance to sort of address what Tom, because Tom also raised the interesting emphasis that Gadamer has on work, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's in Heidegger, you know, like handwork, like you're swinging a hammer, you're plowing the field, right? You're getting your hands dirty.
I wanted to riff on what Tom had brought up.
That's good.
That another way to think about this with Weber versus Heidegger is, I was kind of thinking of it as a metaphor for this kind of primacy of, so Weber to me, in my limited familiarity with him, is that Weber's trying to theorize practical life, like as a sociologist. And so is his mode of theorizing this kind of diminutive mode of theorizing that Gadamer, in working on Heidegger, in Heidegger's work on the Greeks, is trying to say we shouldn't separate theorizing so much from practical life. And that's what makes Weber an amateur to Strauss, because Weber is too theory heavy about practical life, something like that. That's how I was kind of reading it.
Sorry. Yeah, good. Jade Golding?
I was going to say too that God it says someone, I'm trying to find that passage there, but that Weber is a powerful figure. So there's some kind of, I think John would say, some little bit of in joking involved here, but I remember Gadamer saying that everybody was trying to outdo Weber. And Weber had tea parties, invited people to go to their tea parties. And if I do recall, Gadamer attended one of these, and he was quite inspired by Weber. Weber has the idea of science and politics and so forth as vocations, and that there is some type of ethical neutralities that come in between them. Maybe that's what he's talking about. But certainly, there is a great respect for Weber. That was my take on it. I have to look at the German a little bit closer, though. But I'll put my hand down now.
Okay, thanks. Don Marshall, then we'll let John bring us back to Csaba's.
Well, I agree. I don't want to get too far away from the theory of practice and the context for that discussion in the essay. But I think Tom touches on something which struck me. I'm not sure if it's central or something, but there's a lot of very personal comments here by Gadamer. He talks about, oh, I had my dissertation and thank God it disappeared without sight. Oh, it's been rediscovered in the archives in Munich. Oh, I remember when Heidegger was leaving for Marburg and he had this big bonfire up in the mountains and he gave this speech and he talked about this and that and the other thing. And oh, I remember Leo Strauss said this. There are about 6 or 7 of these intrusions, you might call it, of the personal, but in an odd way, I think in terms of sort of tone or genre. This is not Plato, but he is bringing the actualities of his professorial existence and of his relations with Heidegger. He's bringing them in a very concrete way. It's not just sort of floating up here, but he's giving you sort of glimpses behind the curtains of the professors getting together and talking. And oh, Heidegger did this and he was worried about Christianity and I knew him and we talked about this and we were walking on a path one day and he said, you know, I think that there's a function to those personal remarks. They aren't just the digressive narration. It is not what Longinus calls with Homer narrative old age, you know, that he just has a story he has to tell you, you know. I think there's a function for it.
But I guess that was what struck me. And I guess I was relating that to the theory and practice because it's about the work of theory and the work. It's not just about where does it sit in the kind of grand scheme of things, you know, it's the work of phronesis and the work of theorizing. And in a sense, yeah, showing this kind of flip side of the professor, like you say, is that they just see that it's such the sort of recurrent figures, even though it's a short essay. You know, it's something that I found quite hard to ignore. I do acknowledge, I did say at the start, it's a bit of a footnote, but I find these things interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Okay, John Beach, ready to take us back.
Well, I'd like to take back my impression that I left about Tom's remark. And I'm going to continue on, so it's a two thing here, but that I mean about Weber, but that all of these references that Don pointed out so well, you have to know Gadamer really well to get the point he's making. And I would say it's particularly about the Weber one. In the first lecture of the beginning of philosophy, when Gadamer is talking about the different views about the end of philosophy as the end of metaphysics, he equates and he puts Weber in the category with Heidegger, and that's great respect he has for Weber, you know, because Weber saw the same sort of problem in the future that Heidegger did, and so that was. But I mean, all of these you have to really know Gadamer's work well to get them. So the other thing I was going to say to Szabo is that I think that the point you've brought out is very crucial because everything that Gadamer says and that Heidegger says falls. If you are right, it all collapses, because like, what is facticity? Like, is facticity theoretical or is it practical? Or what? And I think the whole effort, that the whole origin of Heidegger's brilliance into Greek thought was that you couldn't separate these things ultimately, and that the situatedness itself, for example, the Finkel, like that's an instance of thinking begins, is always situated, and I think that's so I think it's a very crucial question you mentioned. But in listening to this discussion and your question, I've realized it's so more important to the entire work of both Heidegger and Gadamer and their understanding of the Greeks. I just wanted to thank you for that.
Okay, great. Niall.
Yeah, it just seems to me that this whole hermeneutics of facticity is completely practical. It's not theoretical for Heidegger or for Gadamer. Heidegger uses the term pre-theoretical, right? So Heidegger is trying to get back before theory, so that there is the prejudice of theory that is modern philosophy, that he wants to get back to the Greeks to find the primacy of praxis. The only way he can do that is to invert Aristotle's order, in which theory is higher, contemplation is higher than the practical life. So it seems to me it's not facticity cannot be theoretical because it's not an object.
Well, how can you have elucidation and wakefulness and say it's not there's no theoretical component to it?
Because
how can you do that?
But by the same token, Gadamer is very keen that he's not interested in other terms like apprehension or capturing or seizing or conceptualizing. That's a very theoretical activity. Elucidation is precisely the movement of life interpreting its own movedness. It's elucidation in a sense. It's bringing itself, the contingent historical I is bringing its own historical situation before itself. But it could have been otherwise. And that it could have been otherwise makes it an object of practical affairs and not an object of the theoretical life.
Well, see, our idea, I think, of theoretical is unfair to sort of force it onto them, because for them, it's not distinguished ultimately from practical thinking. I think we're reading it into them. That's what
But it's completely distinguished by Aristotle himself. You have in the metaphysics, it's the superior science, right? It's good. I realize there's a historical
it's theology,
ordering of books, but
the first philosophy is ultimately because it's about God. It's
exactly.
theology. So
it's the human being engaging in something that the gods engage in all the time.
If I may intervene, there is, I think, a way to reconcile a bit the tension I brought into the discussion. What I wanted to insist on is a certain independence or autonomy of theory or theoretical cognition, which is simply neglected in Gadamer, and that's a separate question whether in Heidegger it is similarly the case. I think it's the case, but that's another discussion. But I didn't want to sweep away Gadamer's position. I would be very satisfied with a position claiming that the basis for all our practical and theoretical considerations and cognition is our life word, if you accept this Husserlian term, or the meaningful framework of our life, where we have self-elucidation, also self-understanding, and so forth. But there are dimensions, theoretical cognition or knowledge for one, and very importantly, aesthetic attitudes or fine art. That would be, by the way, again a case where Wachsamkeit or wakenness would be very likely a necessary precondition. And if you say this, then we can claim with John Beach that there is no fundamental separation of the theoretical and the practical, because there's a basic layer of meaningful framework or lived experience or whatever you want to call this. But he can maintain that theoretical cognition, and also Staunen, Taumatzen, and being surprised at the specific scientific discovery. You are not simply doing practical ordinary life.
Right. Pretty.
Yeah, thanks, Csaba. Don, you want to get in here?
Well, yeah, I don't want to get off on interpretation of Aristotle, which is again an endlessly fascinating topic. But I think sort of with what John Beach was saying, what Gadamer, I mean, think about how Gadamer thinks about this. The theory he's talking about is what he's describing when he says on page 31, any thinking can gain enlightenment and conceptual clarity from one's own linguistic tradition. So it's ordinary language that rises into concepts. And Heidegger, he says on 34, like the Greeks, loaded the words of our language with conceptual functions and refreshed the life of the language of thought. That is, if theory floats off from the hermeneutics of facticity, then it enters into a different realm. Okay, but if it keeps contact with that through the language it uses, and he says our concepts, he says on 30, what the Greeks understood. Heidegger was the first to grasp what the Greeks understood. Our concepts develop out of the words of our language. Okay, now that's theory. Now he is willing to say the Greeks did something else. They also in mathematics came up with the notion of proof. Okay, and Heidegger's own view, and this is on page 33. There's a little at the bottom of 33. There's a little thumbnail sketch which I really would like your help. I think I understand, or here's what I understand him to say. When he's talking about practice and theory, he's talking about that kind of theory, namely the way in which the language of everyday life rises up into a conceptual realm. That's not the same as metaphysics. That's not the same as metaphysics. And so he says the path of Western, and that was Heidegger's objection, was the step into metaphysics. Theory was okay in its connection, as long as it stayed connected with practice. But when it took a step into metaphysics, not so good. Why? Because it overshadowed. Metaphysics then overshadowed practical thinking, practical life, the hermeneutics of facticity. So he says, well, the Greek mathematics, he says the Western thought has several steps. The first is Greek mathematics, where proof arises. The second step is Aristotle's metaphysics, as it moves into metaphysics. And the third is the Jewish theology of creation and the Christian message of salvation, reformulating the Greek beginning and Latin concepts. Okay. And then all of this leads up to the fateful turn, which is when the church turns to modern science. Okay. That is, science emerges as a mode of thinking. And there, it not only overwhelms practical thinking, the hermeneutics of facticity, it turns the practical into something else, namely the application. Practice as the application of theory. And it also, in the very process, overturns metaphysics by saying metaphysics really doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning. Okay, it's meaningless jargon. Okay, so scientific math, when it takes over and dominates, as it were, overshadows or crushes both the theoretical and the practical as the Greeks understood them. And that is oddly the heritage of metaphysics, which had already begun to overshadow the practical. Okay, at least that's how I am reading that, and he says it didn't sort of have to be this way, because then science, the practical, becomes practical know-how. It becomes the knowledge of knowing how to do things and control things. And he says the Greeks were great that's why he says here, the Greeks were very good at technique. They were great artisans, but they still took, as he says, their orientation from life. They still took that from practical, well, phronesis, hermeneutics, the hermeneutics of facticity. Okay. So they did not take that fateful step into technology, which is the fateful step into science, as Gadamer sees it. That, I think, is the outline of the course here. And what he's talking about are modes of self-elucidation. There is a Greek mode of self-elucidation, the practical theoretical intertwine. Then there's the mode of metaphysics. Whoops. Then there's the mode of Latinizing metaphysics. Whoops again. Then there's the mode where it turns into modern science. Oh my God, we're in trouble now. Okay. These are all modes of, and he's saying we need, science is not the only way. In fact, it's not the right way if we're going to take care of ourselves spiritually as human beings. We need to model our philosophy on the thinking of the Greeks and get back to practical life, rising into a conceptual self-elucidation. Okay. Now, I apologize for the length of this little thumbnail sketch, but that's how I read it. Maybe I'm misreading it, but I thought that was what he was getting at.
I think it makes perfect sense of what's going on at the bottom of 33 leading to 34, where he announces his thesis that we should all see in the Greeks a kind of model as we philosophize in the age of science. I have a question for you, Don, and that is, when you talk about the self-elucidation of the practical, do you see that activity of self-elucidation as part of the fulfillment of the practical, or something that should be brought to the practical above and beyond? So, for example, I mean, he's got an example of later environmental consciousness. So there's ways in which, say, we'll do the farmer example, work in the fields, he or she has this understanding of what to do, but they are not raising this to a kind of self-elucidation in the context of sustainability and environmental consciousness. Is the activity of bringing things to consciousness, what I'm doing right now in a certain way, part and parcel of the activity? So the activity is incomplete if you're not reflecting upon it and becoming practically thoughtful about what we're doing. Is that reflection element built into the activity, or is that something that comes afterwards that we should add to it? Do you understand?
I think you put it very right when it's not an add-on.
Yeah.
It's not just a sort of an optional, oh, and by the way, let's think about this. Human beings do think about it. That's the point of the Phaedo when he says, we want to understand the way things are, but we have to understand them in terms of the good. Because if we understand them in simply mechanical ways, we don't really understand them. Okay. And I think he's thinking that we don't, practice is not really, he puts this way in relation to virtue. When you pursue virtue, you already have a theoretical orientation toward the nature of virtue. And he's even called this Greek intellectualism. Okay. And it can go too far. It can go too far into a theory of, into a metaphysics, But yes, human action is a process of thinking. It is self-elucidation. That is what we do. And that self-elucidation is theoretical. In the restrained sense of theory, where we don't turn it into metaphysics and we don't turn it into science.
All right, thanks. That helps a lot. Niall.
I mean, it seems the word that strikes me, the type of thinking which it's deliberation, isn't it? Isn't it what Aristotle means? It's the type of thinking, it's the type of seeing the type of seeing involved in the practical life is different to the type of seeing involved in the theoretical life, right? So deliberation deliberates about that which is otherwise. Again, and theory doesn't do that. And that's where I get stuck a little bit because I don't think we can rip them apart. They're mutually implicating, but I think keeping them distinct is a little bit helpful in terms of their object, the scope of what their approach.
I apologize for breaking in, but I just want to say I think the point at which you make the distinction between what can be otherwise, and we're thinking about that, as opposed to what is necessary.
Yeah,
that's the step into metaphysics.
But that's in Aristotle. You would agree?
It is partly in Aristotle, but
Yeah.
I think it's overestimated. I mean, Joseph Owens already said Aristotle is not this metaphysical system builder that he's been turned into by the Latin tradition. Okay, and you see things like that even in the book, the book Delta, where he talks about he gets into the whole terminology, but the terminology, as he describes it, rises out of the many as he keeps saying, we say this in many ways. It rises out of our ordinary language, which is rooted in our ordinary experience. And then he tries to say, but there's a primary way in this. He conceptualizes it and develops it. But I don't think Aristotle is all metaphysics.
Okay, true.
But we're fighting over interpretations of Aristotle, which are not simple.
If I can, I was interested in this. There seems to be a transition from page 31 where he talks about the philologist in me always kind of expressed a resistance to Heidegger's etymology. And by page 34, he's all about the etymology. It seems he's all about the ousia, meaning this, it blew my mind. And on page 31, he's talking about, and then at the end, he's talking about various philologists missing the point altogether and not having done anything. They were more careful than Heidegger, but never as deep as Heidegger. There just seems to be a bit of a tension. He's wearing two hats a little bit, right? He puts on his cap that is I'm a philologist too, and I was resistant to Heidegger's moves, but nothing blew me away more than this concept of ousia and the kind of provenance of the term.
I'm glad you brought that up now, because I was going to bring that up if you didn't. So let's try to bring closure to the relationship theory practice stuff. We'll get back to Shaba. If it's on the topic, Shaba, you open this up for us. You can have the last word on it too.
No. I just wanted to continue with the topic mentioned both by Don and yourself, namely that we should take the Greeks as our models in doing philosophy, because I have certain problems or difficulties with this claim too, because to make it very short, if we take the Greeks as models, then doesn't it necessarily mean that we have to neglect all conceptual innovations after the Greeks? Let me mention the fundamental example central to Gadamer himself, the language of subjectivity, or the basic point of departure of modern thought, the subject, or the perspective of the subject. What would say about this if we take Greek thought as a model? And the second example is, of course, the whole complexes of difficulties in political philosophy, where we have fundamentally different convictions concerning individual human rights and distinction between state and society, which simply have no counterpart or equivalent in Greek thought or concept. So, what do you think about this? That would be my question. And I have a very short remark on Max Weber. I think, and I wrote it in my dissertation on Gadamer, that Weber could be seen as a kind of negative background for Gadamer's question of the truth of fine art, and and the humanities, because he refers to this in volume 3 of the Gesammelte Schriften in a paper that the self limitation of science, of natural science, as an orientational point for human life was a decisive influence on him. And we could say that his question was the use and importance of fine art and the human sciences with regard to orientation of life, and that's a kind of negative resume of Max Weber's famous talk, "Science as a Vocation." But that's a side remark.
Okay, thanks, Shaba. Don, do you want to address that, or John? So to what extent we do or do not want to take the Greeks as a kind of model for us?
Well, I would I would address it. I think that we didn't, but this brings us back to a whole different area of the paper that we haven't gotten into yet. And that's the way, well, we mentioned it, the way philosophy, thoughts, ideas come out of language. And the Greeks are the model for that, because they were, of course, the first people to do philosophy in what we regard as philosophy in the West, and they, used everyday language. The language spoken in the street was where they got their philosophical terms from, and this is why I think even later, at the last paragraph, Gadamer mentions the mother tongue, that no dialogue can only take place within your mother tongue. But it wasn't the results, I would say, of all of the the conclusions that the Greeks came to, but just the way they understood how it worked, how philosophy really was. That's the important part, and we should do this, recognize our sort of relation to language, and how we search for the word, and how it sort of comes forth from discussion, and that this is what real philosophizing is, because you don't know where it's going to end up. It's unpredictable, and this is, so I would say that the Greeks, we've got to get back to that. And Heidegger was the leader in this, because Heidegger said, yeah, okay, this is an alien universe that the Greeks are. That's number one. And then at the same time, you get, how do we connect with this alien universe? And of course, these two things are simultaneous, because the more you recognize the one, the more you recognize the other. And we're still trying to, translate Greek philosophy into modern languages. It doesn't work very well. And so that's why I would say that that I would say, yes, we need to. I understand what he's saying, and this is, he's saying the value of Heidegger is that he did that. He looked at his own facticity, his own situatedness, his own sort of understanding in these early works, and then he looked, and then he saw how the Greeks did this too, like especially in Plato and these discussions, and then you get away from the metaphysical, from the Heidegger called it the fundamentum inconcussum, where everything starts all over again. Of course, it's not a quotation of Descartes at all, but it's just where we just lose all of that, and we start from a new understanding of man and thought as ego and as I and so on, and self-consciousness. And this was Heidegger's way of breaking through that. So I think that philosophy needs to do that.
Though you don't want to say everything since then has been problematic, right, John?
No, because
all sorts of things have come with ideas of autonomy, rights, self-awareness.
Not at all. No, no, absolutely not. And Kant, like, what based on Kant's presuppositions, based on what he discovered, he was, I mean, you can't fault these guys. There's no inconsistency in any of these guys, and the great thinkers. And but there is we're at a point in history right now where we've got to clean things up, and we've got to learn, like, not just what science tells us about the end of the world, which is coming fast, but we got to think about that. We've got to get into this practical stuff in a way that we never have before, to really see how to deal with it. And that's not going to come out of science. Science isn't going to solve that. But that's it's only philosophy can do that. And and it's only philosophy that really understands what science is anyway. I mean, scientists do it, and they do it well. But anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks, John. Jay Goulding, go ahead and get in here.
That's I was just echoing what John was saying too. And that's part of the convergences that Gadamer has of the Alltäglichkeit, of the everydayness of your everyday experience, and also psychic states of things. There's something I pointed out, that the complete works of Dilthey came out at the same time as Being in Time. Actually, Don Marshall wrote a little bit about that, or pointed to the importance of autobiography in Truth and Method. What I was going to say is something that John had said that I completely forgot about in this essay, talking about the divergencies of the house of being one way or another, is that Gadamer mentions Tao in this essay, and I'd totally forgotten about that. So it's Tao and Logos. So this is something that is very distinctively related to Heidegger. And the further you go back into the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, the closer you're going to get to convergences of those positions. Not just the high world of the 4th, 5th century of Athens, but before that. And I'd completely forgotten about that. So Gadamer talks about the distinction of languages and so forth, and now you have to work on this. So there's the Erlebnis, Erfahrung, and Grunderfahrung all connected together. Good on Gadamer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jay. And both you and John emphasize language and these words. I mean, it's a good transition to the concerns raised by Niall. And because it seems like if language as we use it is so important, then understanding the roots of our words and understand where they come from and the meanings that are latent in them that we may not be aware of is a really important exercise. Yet on the other hand, Gadamer expressed some skepticism about just doing etymology and calling it done, as if that is all you need to do in order to unearth the true meaning at the core of these ideas. That's the concern now, right? Is early on he expresses some skepticism, and later on he seems to.
Yeah, I mean, he expresses skepticism, and then he says, it was like a revelation for me to learn. And then he moves to, that's on page 34, that the word being ousia meant, and he continues. And then a little bit further down, he talks about our concepts develop out of the words of our language and thus carry like a mark on their forehead the hour of their birth into the life experience of human beings. That's a beautiful line, but it might not be the most classically philological thing to say, right? And then at the end, at least on page 37, there is I think it's key. He says, the end of the second paragraph, the goal was not to increase our erudition, but to sharpen our sense for the tones and overtones which resonate in our conceptual words when they gain a voice. I think that's what Heidegger does, even if these philologists felt superior to him.
Right. That's good. And gain a voice is a wonderful expression.
Yeah.
And he's talking there about his founding of the Archiv für Begriffsgeschichte.
Yes, with the Ritter,
and said the aim was not, it was not erudition. It was learning to hear what words were saying. And there's a passage that I wanted to quote, which I thought was equally wonderful, and it's on page 30 and 31, where he says, I am still enough of a Platonist to believe that anamnesis is the only form in which thinking begins. Well, what does he mean by anamnesis? As remembrance, thinking grasps what is reflected in a long history of morals, life, suffering, and thought, which has taken many forms of linguistic expression in words and saying, in songs, and the configurations of the plastic arts. This is what philosophy is. This is what reflection is. This is what thinking is. And it isn't just the hermeneutics of facticity. He says, facticity is there because we're unique. Each person is Jeweilichkeit, he says, each person is unique. But it is here that it meets language. And language bears a whole history of human existence. And we need to, because we need to, he says, we need to use language. It says on 38, we use language in such a way that it brings its wisdom to expression. That's philosophy. That's what we should be doing. Okay, that's the Greek model that he's talking about. Okay, and I still would like to get back to Jay Goulding's point, but I'm going to shut up because other people have things to say. But I do want to get back to Jay's point.
But there is the idea of gaining a voice, and on the next paragraph, it becomes the voice of the other starts to emerge, right? There's this reference to the bottom of page 37. It is not about adopting a vocabulary or following rules, but a constant construction of a horizon and an openness to the other, which any language enables. So now we have, yeah, exactly, yeah.
No, in between.
I'm sorry. I will sort of. I apologize, but Jay's point here is there's a global dimension in his thinking in this essay, which should not be missed. He says, I'm here. He does something which I realize now, it took me forever. He often starts essays by talking about the hermeneutic situation, which gives rise to the topic of the essay. And here he talks about going to this conference. And he says it was really attractive because it had people who studied in Germany, but also people who didn't study in Germany. And a little later on, he says, what strengthened my resolve to come here? And you think there's an autobiographical reference. He's 90 years old. He went herring across Germany to talk at this conference. Why? Because there were people here who were not from the Greco-Christian tradition. And he says this in the book of Conversations with Dottori. In the situation we find ourselves in, the only thing that is going to save us is a dialogue among people of different cultural backgrounds, a dialogue among the great religions, ultimately. Okay? And this potentiality of a global dialogue emerging is absolutely fundamental here. And it is what makes this whole point. I mean, why is Heidegger of so much interest to philosophers around the world? That's the question. Okay. And how do we approach them? How do we do this? Okay. So he has this kind of global perspective that is extremely important in the essay, even though it's kind of below the surface.
All right, thanks. So I looked it up, and it was actually the whole conference at the Alexander Foundation was on the continuing relevance of Heidegger's philosophy. I couldn't find that, and the whole thing has been published. I just couldn't find a table of contents because I was curious too. Who are all these people he's referring to? Because he's very aware of who's in the audience in this moment and what they're going to bring up. What I was going to mention was between the two quotes that Niall mentioned on 37 is where Gadamer, well, first, I mean, what Don said about the only form of thinking is a kind of recollection of primordial knowledge. It remembers what has been reflected in long history of morals, life, but there are ways it's done well and done poorly. And he says, when Heidegger had to interpret texts, that's in scare quotes, I often had difficulties with it because he violently bent the texts to his own intentions, and in the process gave voice to the background knowledge of the words. I'm not sure what that last phrase refers to. But clearly it's like the earlier line about etymologies. If you're just gonna play with etymologies, it doesn't have a very long lifespan. It's clever in the moment, but it's not going to last. And this too, there's a certain, it was, eye-opening, but then you sort of realize it's all being sort of spun for his Heideggerian project. Still, what he was doing excited him, right? What he was after and what he was trying to do to liberate the plurality of words was noble, and that's something we should aspire to. So there is a way in which it could be done well or done poorly. I just wanted to mention that as well. And he thinks that at times Heidegger does not do it well, specifically because he just plays with the etymologies, or he violently bends the text to his own intentions. I muted myself first. John Beach, go ahead.
Okay, I just like to throw something in here to this. This is one of these examples that people have brought up about where he seems to go off, tell a little story, but it's on 31 that is set the etymologies aside and so on. And he makes the reference to Rilke in the Duino elegies, and talks about the Nile, the plot is along the Nile. And there's a little thing that relates to this I'm not an authority on Rilke, but I know a bit about him, and he did his it was shortly after the death of one of his friends, his wife's best friend, who was a student of Rodin, and Rilke himself was a student. He had a male mentor. It probably would have been Rodin, and Rodin was a great collector of Egyptian stuff, and he'd have crates of it shipped. He didn't know anything about Egyptian history or any of the scholarship, but that's what gave him inspiration from his. And I'm talking here, about anamnesis. For his sculpture, which is very powerful. And then when Rilke was in Egypt, he finally had a vision of this friend. I just forgot her name for a minute, but she had also studied with Rodin, and she was the best friend of his wife. He met them together. His wife was an artist, and she had died like a few months before. And he said, I finally had a vision. I finally saw her. Like when I was, in Egypt, I finally realized who she was and what it was about. And it was through Egyptian art. So this is an anamnesis. I think an example of Platonic anamnesis and sort of what we're talking about, which is not the astonishment, which Sabo mentioned as well, and to wonder and so on. So whether that's theoretical or practical, or it's irrelevant. But
Thanks, John.
okay.
So Eric, you brought up, Jay, go ahead.
Well, just a very quick point. I've always said that etymologies are the quickest elevator to the ancient world. When you're doing Heidegger, there isn't any etymologies that I've ever looked at that you couldn't find. You can find it, but you have to know where you're looking. For anyone interested in those debates, look at Friedlander, said after 40 years of trying to say that this is wrong, I said, maybe you could argue this way. Heidegger then says, maybe I spend too much time on this. The idea is, it's not what's said, it's what's unsaid. So when you break a word apart, you're bringing other worlds into it. Now, this is what I call vertical reading, right? That breaks the hegemony of horizontal reading. I think that's what Gadamer is about, is trying to talk about as well. Anyway, thank you.
Wait, there we go. Thanks, Jay. Eric raised a question about a sentence on 37. That's a head scratcher. It's in the second full paragraph. Now that's the only one, but it's one of the many. Maybe now we'll turn to head scratchers or firework lighters. The sentence is the third one of the second full paragraph. The paragraph begins, nevertheless, any language is a self-interpretation of human life. That's nice. Heidegger had this in mind from early on with his project of hermeneutics of facticity. Here it is, I think. Such elucidation is always gained from an existence avoiding itself, which is what we are. And this happens in all language. And Eric asks, understandably, what does it mean that this is elucidation is existence avoiding itself? What is the avoidance there he's referring to? Is that right, Eric?
Yeah. It makes me think about like accountability, right? Like people who prioritize their intents over impact or something like this, right? Like where we avoid ourselves because we don't want to own what we've done, like an evasion of responsibility or something like this. This is what I start thinking about. Like, what does it mean to avoid yourself? Like the first thing that I thought of was Adam and Eve putting clothes on. And then when the God walks through the garden looking for them, they hide, but they're not hiding that they're naked. They're hiding that they have clothes on. So in a way, they're avoiding themselves. Like I'm just using that as an analogy here. Like, what does it mean for us to avoid ourselves?
That's clever. They're avoiding the recognition. They're
Mhm.
avoiding the way they're being seen, would be seen through the eyes of God as something has changed here, and now we're wearing clothes. And what does that say about us? All right, Shaba.
I think that this is simply taking over an idea of the early Heidegger, in the sense that Dasein, or to the extent that Dasein always escapes from itself. It has the tendency not to confront itself in its complicatedness. Although you are quite right in pointing to the paragraph as somewhat disturbing, because it's not really clear in what sense a language would be the expression of such an avoidance. If we take what I propose here and trace back this idea to Heidegger, then Heidegger wouldn't say that that this is somehow expressed in language. So I don't have an answer to this second problem. Although there is a reference of Gadamer in the first part of Truth and Method that natural languages have certain metaphors, and there are descriptions implied in these metaphors. That's in the description of play, in the section on play in the first part, and you might say that there is certain wisdom included in the natural metaphorics of every natural language, but that's again not the avoidance claim or thesis.
Yeah, Eric.
I want to keep going further with the paragraph because the next couple sentences get weird too, because okay, so to that extent, we all have the same situation as our starting point for thinking. We are all existence avoiding itself. Okay. It is problematic when several countries in Africa, the French language offers the only possibility of bringing thoughts developed in European philosophy to the people living there. So for me, there's like two different kinds of avoidance. There is the kind of shame or guilt avoidance, where absorbed into the they self, of inauthenticity, versus colonialism preventing a people from recognizing themselves in their own emergent languages. So there's like different, so that connects with me back to, I think, Don, you were saying, bringing up the way where he's thinking globally here, especially when he says something like, It is problematic, for instance, when in several countries in Africa, the French language offers the only possibility. The language of the people there, in which they elaborate their own experience of the world, does not yet, have the possibility of transposing itself into French, perhaps one day. One day we're all going to speak the same. And then he says, philosophy is not this system of communication, though. Like if we all, right, like we're all converging on one language, right? Like a global, what is it? Esperanto or whatever. But even then, that still won't allow us to philosophize with one another, because philosophy is moving beyond the language systems. Something like that. I don't know.
Well, just
Go ahead,
to ask that, or I'd like to comment on both of those passages. Okay. I think what he's talking about in the case of Africa is that if you're an African student in, I don't know, Nigeria, and you take a course in philosophy, they make you read Spinoza. Now, how do you understand Spinoza? Well, you can say, well, I translated it. I think what he's saying is you really need to start with your own language, and you need to build out of your own language insights into what you think. You have to open your own eyes, not just use someone else's language, not just use Spinoza's or Heidegger's or Hegel's language and sort of mouth their jargon. You need to develop something out of your own language. Okay? That takes time. I mean, that is not just a gimme. You don't just sort of sit down and spin it out. It takes a lot of reflections. It's like what he says about anamnesis. You have to find a way in which your language expresses its own wisdom. When you do that, then you will be able to connect with other people's attempts in their language, out of their language, to express that language's wisdom. And that's what he gives example after example of. One of them is where Heidegger quotes Aristotle at the end of the encyclopedia, and Gadamer says he uses the word spirit. This is not a Greek word, okay? But it is Heidegger trying to develop an insight that then connects with the Greek insight, okay? And that is fusion of horizons. But you can't do it if you haven't developed your own language yet. And it's just a fact that the Africans have not been able to do that. That's not against them, and it's not some suggestion that their language is limited, or that they're limited, or that they should not try to express it in their language. No, on the contrary, just the contrary is the case. But they do have to go through that process before they will be able to do that. The business about because it puzzled me too, avoiding existence avoiding itself. What on earth does that mean? So back on page 29, I think here's just does this convince you? At the bottom of page 29, he talks about withdrawal. Okay, withdrawal, the late Heidegger idea, and that is this withdrawal. We try to elucidate ourselves, but ourself withdraws in the very process of our elucidation. That's why there is no absolutely persuasive theoretical language, because it's a process. It's a process of moving from ordinary experience and ordinary language up to conceptualization and back to ordinary language, because the conceptualization it's not like mathematics. It's not going to be proof. It's not going to be apodictic. Okay. So we have to, and this is what it is when Heidegger does his farewell speech and says, weirdly enough, we are, what does he say? The mission of human beings is to stand between this unconcealment of being and its withdrawal. Okay. So we don't just have the language of facticity and then we understand ourselves. Okay. We have to keep doing it constantly, because not only is it revealed to us, unconcealed, it's also withdrawing and concealing itself. Our existence is withdrawing and concealing itself from us in the very act of our trying to understand it. Okay, so that's what I was kind of making of it, if that makes any sense at all. Okay. Yeah.
That makes sense. So we're getting to the point where if there's other things that have not been brought up, highlights, to quote John Beach.
I'm just going to add a little thing to that. And I don't know, I haven't really worked it through, but in the being of time, of course, the authenticity is anxiety. And then, they talk about, Schelling says that anxiety drives us out of the center of our existence. Gadamer quotes that. So there's a certain avoiding of ourselves. That's the way, otherwise we would be paralyzed with anxiety to a certain extent, maybe. I don't know. Just a thought. That helps, sheds any light on anything, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, John.
But I think everything else that was said here was good. But no, it is. I think it's Gadamer's trying to say, what is it that makes Gadamer or Heidegger? At the very end, he's written about this throughout his life, about Heidegger and the Greeks, many times. What is it, that really makes it? What do we learn about the Greeks and about ourselves that Heidegger taught us with regard to the Greeks? And I think that it's this being able to reach out, as he said, shake hands with the Greeks, whereas we both have the same sort of process of situating ourselves in facticity. And this was something that was common, that we can share with the Greeks, and this can be a bridge. And that they and the ousia thing, I mean, that was, I think, we came so consumed with the metaphysical meaning of ousia, its being. But Aristotle used ousia as a word for being, because he said what is most real, and not the eidos, but what is most real is the toti ti. It is the thing, the sensible thing. That's ground. That's Aristotle's ground of being right there. So that's why he preferred the term ousia, whereas Plato, to own was the his favorite. There's about 7 or 8 words for being in Greek, and Aristotle narrowed it down to 4 or something, as Owen says, or maybe 3. But they had no word for being the way we like to think of it. But at any rate, I think that it was the language, it was the relationship to language, and the way that these words just emerged, and Heidegger and his it's wrong to call them etymologies. They're not really etymologies, but he said this is what they're stamped with, and we can identify with this because we have the same experience too as humans. And so I think that was it was the connection. But also Heidegger was the first to recognize the fact that this is an alien universe in Plato and Aristotle, that we've tried to totally paper over the difference and try to try to make it. They're just, amateur us, like just beginners, what we were doing. And then at the same time, he gave a way to form that, to recover them. And I think that's how Gadamer sees Heidegger. And of course, Gadamer disagrees about all kinds of ways that Heidegger translates different words, and the later Heidegger and the event and the contributions. He gets so mixed up trying to sort out what he's done with these Greek terms and made them into metaphysical terms. Gadamer just ignores all that. Don't worry about that. That's not really like how we're going to learn from Heidegger, but because Heidegger would not divorce philosophy from, or Gadamer would not divorce it from philology. And he says you can't do philology unless you're doing philosophy. And Heidegger was the first to show us that too. Heidegger showed us that there's a philosophical question with the Greeks that's the same as our question too. So I think that was what I think he was trying to, just those broad general things he was trying to accomplish in this late paper, 1990.
Can I just say,
Go ahead, Tom.
just on John's point, Gadamer is saying we need to learn from Heidegger. We all need to learn from Heidegger. What do we need to learn from Heidegger? To learn from Heidegger means to learn to think for yourself. If you really understand Heidegger, you will learn to think for yourself. So at the bottom of 35, he says, where Heidegger himself is trying to, guard against this and says, well, my language is a formal indication. Don't take it as a kind of rigid jargon. It's a points in a direction, something like that. By this, he wanted to say that in thinking, one can at best point in a direction. One must open one's own eyes. Only then will one find the language which says what one sees. So I think that's what we learned from Heidegger.
And Gadamer tried to teach me about that. If I'll just give you one little quick example here, so Jay can get in here. Because Gadamer said, give me all your stuff. Give me your MA thesis. Give me all the stuff you've written on Heidegger. And he read it. He really, and I did this stuff on the introduction of metaphysics, how logos separated from physis and all this stuff, the thought and being and so on. And then he asked me, he says, have you read Who is Heidegger's Zarathustra? And which is something that Heidegger had written. I said, no, oh yeah, a long time ago. He says, well, read it again. And then he says, I met him, he says, have you read it yet? And I said, no, next. So I read it. And just to context here, he's trying to tell me, don't use Heidegger's language when you think about Heidegger. Get away from these terms if you can. But he said, okay, well, who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra? Who did you think? And I said, I don't know. I said, Heidegger? And in other words, is Heidegger presenting himself as a prophet here in the Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra? And of course, nothing more was said about it, but he wanted me to give that distance. And I think as Don has hit his finger on it, we can learn a lot from Heidegger, but we can't become a prisoner of his terminology, of his language.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Jay,
that's it.
have the final word.
I was just going to underscore that. We were talking about this before. What Don was saying, find your own place to disappear, is an idea that Heidegger presents. Don't follow me. Find your own place to go. That's to say that he withdraws his positions. Heidegger, as he talks about Hegel or someone, he says that's what they do. I'm doing this. You find your own way. What I wanted not to let go is that Gadamer mentioned a person next to Weber that is kind of lost in our era that's worth looking at is Werner Jaeger, was the #1 philologist in Europe, head of the in Berlin of the archaeological school. He's got some amazing stuff. Werner Jaeger would be worth looking at. And then last thing, this is this idea of showing forth. I moved from, as I said, from hermeneutics as a Bedeutung to a Auslegung to Interpretieren to Andeuten, to showing forth or pointing to. Further you go back, even when you're looking all of these things up, you can see these things will be occurring in all the dictionaries. So we have it's tended to end the quest of things by calling something a meaning rather than it showing forth. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.